Looking back, the age of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was a strange one at that. Just like the PlayStation and the Wii, and maybe the DS if you're being generous, the SNES was graced with a lot of library production support from third-party manufacturers, and it was also a continuing age of innovation of the newly burgeoning console market, having been saved by this console's little brother. Mechanical additions like the capacitor that allowed saves to occur, along with developing the now obsolete password system that was basically checkpoints stored on paper rather than in code, since it did exist at that point. New genres of games were being found and new artistic strides were being made in the realm of interactive entertainment, and one of the many notable experiments was with Donkey Kong Country that we're talking about today, one of the very few 3D modeled games put onto the Super Nintendo. Rareware was birthed from humble beginnings in the UK, working on arcades and the ZX Spectrum of all things, but like many companies, it became intrigued a year or two after Nintendo brought out the Nintendo Entertainment System. The team liked the technology, and so started successfully reverse engineering the Famicom and built several test programs on the device that they had figured out. Having shown the results to Nintendo, the Japanese company became incredibly interested and granted the team, who at this time already produced many successful titles, such as Saber Wolf, Jetpack, and Knight Lore, were granted by Nintendo an honest-to-God unlimited budget to make games with. That's about as bold a move as when Capcom decided to create a video game cinematic universe around Resident Evil after the original game's launch. But hell, it worked out gangbusters for Nintendo, since the lack of budgetary concerns led Rareware to work with many other developers and produced tons of titles for their new partner. A TMNT game, Snake Rattle and Roll, and the infamous Battletoads, among many other titles. With the staggering success of their workload, Rareware became a brand synonymous with Nintendo, and after a bit of dabbling and the console generation flipping over, Rareware was finally given the green light to make their 3D Donkey Kong platformer, Donkey Kong Country, a game that went on to become a smash hit and one of the most recognizable titles for the system. This game was not only a tremendous technological leap in seeing what you could actually accomplish within the SNES's abilities, but also an expansion of the lore surrounding one of Nintendo's iconic characters, bringing in a lot of new character and world building to a monkey who was pretty much just a static sprite up until this point, with the addition of Diddy and Cranky Kong, alluding to an entire clan and or family that DK leads on this island paradise. The game also introduced the interesting antagonist regime of the Kremlings, a Koopa clan sort of arrangement of amazingly bumbling dullards who are useless at everything except stealing bananas from the Kongs occasionally, led by the completely ridiculous King K. Rool, a comical, fat lizard king who manages to be one of the most rage-inducing jerks in all of the games by the time we're through. The story of the game is actually pretty simple for this obvious sort of thing. The Kremlings managed to overcome their own stupidity for 5 seconds and stole the entire banana horde from the Kongs, and now DK and Diddy have to go get it back. And likewise for platformer franchises of Nintendo, this back and forth is going to happen way more times than it has any right to. And so, Donkey and Diddy set out for their next great adventure. While the game falls into the typical trappings of a light plot Nintendo game, where the game really shines bright as a halogen is in its art style. While the idea to go 3D on the sprite work was a bold one at that, it does have some slight problems. The alignments of the main characters to the platforms can be a bit wonky at times, especially with the game's difficulty design that we'll talk about later. Hitboxes can miss a bit more than you would like, and overall the game isn't as fluid and smoothly performing as a fast-paced performer should be working, which DKC is trying to be some of the time. But DKC isn't so heavy on the time requirements, so you do get some margin for error and time to think. A bigger fault of the 3D sprites is that you aren't allowed so much style in your gameplay, with the most notable being the difficulty in performing multiple enemy jumps due to the offbeat timing throwing off some players with the hitboxes and needing to perform your actual jump to get the distance, along with the rather big punishment for screwing it up, where you lose your HP by getting struck by something that you couldn't sort of control by your own hands. But overall, while the game lacks that polished quickness that Super Mario World was better at performing, what you get in spite of that is one of the most inspired worlds that was ever brought to this platform. While most of the game is set in jungle lands for the obvious reason, when you start getting through that stuff, the game will start throwing underwater, cave, frozen crystal, and mine levels at you, with a whole bunch getting some unique mechanics between the lot of them that make some of them the highlight of the game and continues to show off the creative drive that Rareware had back in the day. Frankly, the game's soundtrack deserves particular mention, as some tracks are well remembered to this day. Likewise, this being the SNES, the playlist isn't exactly prolific as Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. However, the composer at Rareware hit the nail on the head with bringing across the environment of the level and some of that frenetic tension that accompanies the game's level design, frequenting unseen challenges upon the player in the attempts to trip them up and test their platforming abilities. In an age of great chiptunes being produced, DKC had a real, sort of orchestral feel to it that distinguished it from its peers in yet another way. But while this was one of another great highlights that made Donkey Kong Country one of the nostalgic titles of the SNES, the ultimate point that defined its legacy was Rareware's commitment to the philosophy of the Nintendo Hard motto. It's something that should be a positive for the developers that they were one of the teams that was proud to build games in the old school mentality, where a video game was something that wasn't truly experienced until it was totally destroyed. What I'm really getting at is that Donkey Kong Country is a legendarily difficult game to beat on its original console. DKC is honestly a little bit of a sadistic game when you get down to it, welcoming you into the door with a start with its fun levels, wimpy enemies that you can dispatch in a second, the great music and the animal companions that make you even more powerful, and varying up the gameplay even more that rewards the player who are actually good at the game, and then by the end, DKC has shoved so many shoes up your ass that you can start calling yourself Leatherface for how many souls you'll be throwing up. To be fair, the sequel ramped the philosophy up quite a bit more, but the original still has a place at the table for the hard games. I know that some people will say that the difficulty is the point of the game, and that DKC is at its best when you've beat your way to a hard-won victory in a grueling level where life and death are a second away from each other. But that hearty feeling of satisfaction comes at the expense of, like 20 attempts at it and having to learn every platform and movement necessary to hit all the hurdles exactly? Personally, I think having such a high barrier to entry is doing the game a disservice for not letting people get to see more levels, more of these interesting gameplay ideas in those levels, and most of all, get to see more bosses and ultimately King K. Rool as a pirate. I'm not gonna say that this game needs to be as easy as Bob-omb Battlefield the whole way through, but requiring these split-second platforming skills constantly gets very frustrating, especially when too many fuck-ups don't just dump you to the start of the level. You might have to backtrack through several old levels since the save points are on the map itself and not at every level. Unfortunately for the old school defender, there's a reason why this game's difficulty design feels obsolete, and that's because this idea of needing to battle the game in order to beat it was always more frustrating than it was satisfying. Like in the perpetual comparison Dark Souls and maybe even Cuphead, yes, it was a similar idea, but the reason why the repeating of these sections in the games aren't as annoying as it is in DKC is more that you learn the difficulty as you're struggling against it, and each time you get a little bit of an edge on it as you are learning. You're progressing each time, and more importantly, Dark Souls gives you different ways of getting around enemies and bosses, and that experimentation turns into satisfaction when you find a good strategy. whereas in DKC, it's annoying because you don't really have multiple ways of doing a level, and all it ends up becoming is just learning the predetermined steps in order to progress along, with the addition of having to repeat more than just that level to get back to where you started because of where the save points are located. We'll be talking about this more in the sequel, but yeah, I just didn't like how punishing Donkey Kong Country was by the end of the game. However, even then the negative shows off the creativity of Rareware, since there's a bunch of ways that the developer put in DKC to provide different forms of difficulty. You have the regular walk through the level and platform your way to victory. You have the levels with a heavy emphasis on the animal companions, which change up the level design to be more fast-paced and adrenaline pumping. The classic explorative levels underwater, which turn into a trap-filled labyrinth. And then you have the minecart levels, which are, I don't know, a mixed bag? The minecart levels are the fastest of the whole game, with split-second jumping being needed, so they are super intense sections of the game, but then again, the nature of this design makes it incredibly easy to screw up and lose an entire run of the level, so I guess it would depend on what you're looking for in a video game there. The bottom line is that DKC is a game filled with ingenuity. There are tons of level-specific gimmicks throughout the game that make quite a few of the levels iconic and make for some satisfying wins once you get everything working on all cylinders. And a special note for the game goes to another nice thing about the old Rareware is that, like the Kirby games, DKC is a game that is filled with unique levels and challenges, but rather than just ending with a fully fun and functional game, Rareware also added a bit of style to the game that makes it stand out even more. Like with HAL Labs making space for their protagonists to do cute dances and animations, Rareware left enough space on the cartridge for funny dialogue. Now, this is still the SNES, so any dialogue is going to be limited. Hell, one of the DKC games makes a joke about this specifically. But when you do go around to Cranky Kong throughout this game, he'll always have a sarcastic quip to toss at Donkey Kong and the player about how they're dumb and bad at things. But like any good sarcastic humor, Cranky Kong means it in jest, and it works because it's actually funny. And the best thing about it is that Cranky Kong was given a lot to say. I remember at one point while playing this game, I went to Cranky's cabin and deliberately saw if I could exhaust his dialogue. And I never actually found out if I could. I went to the cabin back to back 12 to 15 times. And each time he had a different sarcastic jab to say. The charm of Rareware's humor is shown here and there throughout the series in little ways, but the fact that the team sequestered so much of it to Cranky Kong is what helps bring Donkey Kong Country into its own as a fully realized video game. Like some first games that went on to become long-lasting franchises, in spite of the game's many strides forward and feels of its skillful design abilities, Donkey Kong Country certainly has the identity of a guinea pig game around it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I remember Mario Party feeling the exact same way, where the team at Rareware weren't 100% sure about the game and in trying to get to the core of what they were attempting to make there, but while they were doing that, they threw idea after idea at it and just strung the whole thing together and ended up creating a blockbuster. However, you can usually tell a guinea pig game from a lack of narrative, an abrupt ending, which is why these first games tend to feel more like tech demos, simply because they were probably an unprecedented concept when they were being developed, and they wanted to make the game first before they decided to invest in supporting it with a story of its characters. Perhaps with the knowledge that Rareware had the full backing of Nintendo's massive wealth, they were confident they were going to get another game out of the property, which turned out to be 110% correct. It was going to be no surprise that this game was going to retro-review extremely well. The introduction of 3D graphics to the Donkey Kong series, the new characters and enemies, and all these locales to look forward to, with this challenging and unique platforming style filled with the trips, tricks, and twists that'll provide a more satisfying victory for the ones who can stick it out. The art style is simply phenomenal, with the different types of levels, the extra details throughout all of them that make the levels beautiful and colorful, all accompanied by one of the great soundtracks of the genre. While the game suffers slightly for its old school style difficulty, the wonderful direction that this game had during development shines through in many facets, and this game helped to continue cementing the admiration of Rareware throughout the audience of video games back in the day, and it is still as rewarding to play now as it was back in the day, now that checkpoints, save states, and generally just ignoring the old difficulty has been made possible. If you haven't had the chance, I would highly suggest checking out this series that helped to put the people at Rare on the map. Let's end this video with a final scoreboard. And a well-deserved victory for gamers, because you all deserve it. Thanks for coming in today.